Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics from the American Civil War to the Korean War. Welcome to this virtual presentation by the MacArthur Memorial. My name is Amanda Williams. We are delighted to have you joining us, whether it's live or if you're watching this at a later date or listening to it at a later date. Thank you for taking the time to explore history with us. At the MacArthur Memorial, we like to say there is no substitute for history. This belief drives our mission to preserve and present the story of General Douglas MacArthur and the millions of men and women that served with him through free exhibits, education programs, events, and programs online just like this, ensuring that current and future generations have access to our shared history. You help support this mission just by using our resources, by visiting the museum, or by accessing content like this program. If you'd like to boost your support, though, we invite you to join the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation's MacArthur Committee. For details, we have a QR code on screen, and we'll have a link in the program description for more information. Today, our topic is the 34th Naval Construction Battalion, the first African American Seabee Battalion in U.S. naval history. During World War II, the 34th commissioned and trained right here in Norfolk, Virginia, the home of the MacArthur Memorial, before being sent to the Pacific. So we will have some time for Q&A after the talk tonight. So if you are watching live, please make sure to put your questions in the comments section. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Frank Blazich, an absolutely outstanding scholar and a wonderful friend of the MacArthur Memorial. He is Curator of Modern Military History at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, and he brings exceptional expertise and passion to the field of military history. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Frank Blazich.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Amanda, for the very kind introduction. It's always a privilege to work with the MacArthur Memorial on any project, much less to have the opportunity to share some of my research with you. I hope this talk will prove of interest or at least offer something new. Now, I want to give a quick disclaimer. I use period language, so there may be some language here that will cause consternation. I've tried to dial it down, so to speak, to try and avoid anything that might not be safe, so to speak. But rather than adjust things, I try to use the period vernacular. With that said, in the great words of, Ed Sullivan, we have a really big show for you all tonight. So here we go. Now, stories first appeared in California newspapers on 3 March 1945 with headlines blaring, as you can see here, Negroes on hunger strike at Hueneme, 1,000 Navy men refuse base food, or Hueneme Seabees go on hunger strike. And yet the next day, the same story begins to appear in the Midwest and the East Coast, noting Pacific veterans on hunger strike, or Negro veterans on hunger strike at Camp and West, or Seabees hunger strike still on. And by 5 March, at the conclusion of the strike, the headlines would simply state, Hunger strike of Seabees at Hueneme ended, Navy says. Over just 2 days, the factor of race had lost its potency in comparison with 1,000 sailors voluntarily refusing to eat for 2 straight days. The Black Seabees of the 34th Naval Construction Battalion had endured 21 consecutive months of overseas service in the South Pacific, and over 2 years of repressive discriminatory treatment known only to select members of the Black community. Their mass protest hunger strike, however, proved the culminating action in effecting racial personnel policy changes at the highest levels of the Navy Department. But how did this relatively obscure naval unit suddenly appear in national press thanks to a hunger strike? Why did this system generate such a challenge to lawful authority? Now, when the Bureau of Yards and Docks, or BUDOCS, commissioned this battalion on October 23, 1942, they represented the first large unit organization of Black sailors outside of the messman branch. And quite frankly, for that matter, this is the first large unit of Black sailors ever assembled in the history of the United States Navy. The 1,160 men of the battalion included 880 Black and 280 white sailors from 37 states, as well as the District of Columbia, thereby also making the battalion the Navy's first large segregated unit in World War II. For the ensuing 29 months, the corrosive influence of racism, aided and abetted by a blend of organizational ignorance and dismissiveness that was pervasive within the United States Armed Forces at the time, produced a civil rights incident of national significance. Now, the largest group of Black sailors outside of the messman's branch of the Navy, the Black Seabees represented something akin to an experiment for Navy race policies and a methodical movement to integration. Framed within the literature of the Navy and integration, a specific history of the 34th really also opens a window into the civil rights movement of the 1950s. And you see this through the blending of grassroots activism as well as agency combining forces with civil advocacy groups and the press. But the Black Seabee story until now has really remained relegated to small anecdotes, if at that. But these men, trained to build and fight, played an integral part in the history of African Americans fighting a war for double victory: victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home, including within the military. Now, prior to American entry into World War II, the Navy could look back at almost 2 decades of racial exclusivity. From 1913 to 1921, Blacks represented only 1.2% of the entire enlisted strength of the Navy. And I should clarify, there were no Black officers at this time. Between August 1919 to December 1932, the Navy had halted all Black enlisted recruiting. Thereafter, they only relaunched recruiting to fulfill annual messman branch quotas. Now, Black, Filipino, or Chinese messmen wore uniforms, you can see one here, at insignia which differed from enlisted sailors, and this was largely done to emphasize their lower caste. What were the duties of a messman? Well, it included setting the officers' tables, serving meals, cooking, mending their uniforms, polishing silverware in their shoes. The messmen had neither a proficiency test nor even written manuals. As of 1950, they represented 2.3% of the Navy's total enlisted strength of 170,000 sailors. By December 41, the entire number of Black sailors rated, i.e., these are men with specific skills and abilities in a distinct occupation, in the regular Navy, as well as the Fleet Reserve, and men returned from retirement outside of the messman branch numbered only 43 sailors. But with ongoing wars in Europe and the Pacific, these will stoke the furnace for increasing the number of Blacks in American military service. The Black press, as well as influential Black voices and organizations like the National Urban League and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, were fighting for change. And with a presidential election approaching and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt needing Black voter support, military service became a fulcrum for action. With the Selective Service and Training Act, passed in 1940, there was language in there allowing Blacks and other racial minorities to enlist and be drafted without discrimination. Now, the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, in here, established a committee on July 2nd, 1941, to investigate whether the enlisted personnel of the naval service adequately represented the nation. Hint, they didn't. Now, Knox requested corrective suggestions if the committee was to find evidence of discrimination on grounds of race, creed, color, or national origin. And the committee's majority report of this 4-man committee arrived at Knox's desk on 24 December. And this report concluded that enlisting Blacks for anything other than mess attendance, quote, leads to disruptive and undermining conditions. Oh, the humanity. And the report concluded that within the limitations of characteristics and intelligence of members of certain races, the enlisted personnel of the naval establishment is representative of all citizens of the United States. Therefore, no corrective measures are necessary. Harumph then. But with entry into World War II and a need for rapid expansion, the Navy essentially was choosing to defend the status quo and not risk any plan for integrating Black sailors, which they thought would endanger national defense. But the Minority Report of 31 December, written by Mr. Addison Walker, who was Special Assistant to Assistant Secretary of the Navy Ralph Bard, stood in sharp contrast. And I apologize for the quality of the images here, taken with my camera in the National Archives, but this is part of his report here. Walker argued that, quote, a man's right to fight for his country is probably more fundamental than his right to vote. And he suggested that we could recruit a small number of Blacks as an experiment in the Navy. They could serve on patrol or other small vessels assigned to naval stations or yards. And this experiment, quote, might prove to be of considerable value in the case the Navy is later directed to accept enlistment from the Selective Service roles. and also position the Navy to broaden opportunities for a minority group which is becoming increasingly articulate in its demands. Now, a few weeks prior to Walker's report, Walter White, who was the NAACP secretary, telegrammed Secretary Knox and asked if the direct declaration of war on 8 December had or would cause any policy change allowing blacks to serve, as the present policy, in White's words, is doing more than almost any other single thing to dampen the enthusiasm of Negroes for all-out aid to their country. Now, the Bureau of Navigation replied for Secretary Knox a week later, and it said, look, there has been no change, nor is any change contemplated. But undeterred, Walter White shared all these telegrams with President Roosevelt, and he appealed to his commander-in-chief to order the Navy to abandon its policy of refusing to permit blacks to enlist as anything other than messmen. Now, as the Navy's chewing over this idea, perhaps to develop a plan for black enlistees, a new organization within the Bureau of Yards and Docks will begin to take form. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, and in particular Wake Island, senior naval officials suddenly recognized that international law prohibits civilian contractors working on bases in the Pacific or the Atlantic to take up arms lest they be summarily executed as guerrillas. And on December 28, 1941, Rear Admiral Ben Morrell, senior as Vice Admiral, who was chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, wrote to the Bureau of Navigation stating that civilian contractors could not be utilized for advanced base construction in work in combat zones. And this thus necessitated the organization of military construction forces of uniformed personnel under direct military command. And Morrell detailed how naval reservists enlisted in the V6 General Service classification would be organized into 3 battalions, each of 1,072 personnel, commanded by Civil Engineer Corps or CEC officers, and these would be units able to build and defend construction projects outside the continental limits of the United States. Now, the design of the battalion included all necessary ratings to operate as a complete self-sufficient unit in the field. And the Bureau of Navigation approved Morrell's request on 5 January 42 for the Naval Construction Forces destined to be known as the Seabees, or Construction Battalion Seabee. And on January 22nd, 42, Ben Morrell wrote to Commander John R. Perry of BUDOX, who was tasked with building up the Seabee force. And he explained to Perry that the Bureau of Navigation had inquired about BUDOX accepting colored workers for construction battalions. And Morrell said, I see no reason to refuse. We need skilled workers. This far outweighs any issue of race. Furthermore, the construction battalions then could offer an avenue for skilled black workers to directly transfer their civilian talents into the Navy and the war effort. In stark contrast to, say, bringing in unskilled labor or making these men do the rather somewhat demeaning work of being mess attendants or stewards. The day after this correspondence between Morrell and Perry, the Navy's General Board held hearings on the subject of blacks in these new naval construction battalions. Captain Francis E.M. Whiting, who's director of recruiting at Bureau of Navigation, stated that this effort to try and bring 5,000 black men into the Navy would only be, quote, an opening wage. Adding, we may think that we are winning the program if we simply assign these people to construction regiments. Once they get into construction regiments, there will be pressure brought on the Navy Department to put them in small patrol vessels and gasp, maybe large ships. Oh, the humanity. Oh, the humanity. And further in these same hearings, Captain Harry A. Badd, B-A-D-T, Badditt, who's BUNAV's Director of Enlisted Personnel Division, noted to Admiral Jacobs that, quote, he does not want to enlist Negroes for general service, and if the Navy has to take them, send them to the construction battalions. As they noted, we already have all white construction battalions being enlisted, and if we create black construction battalions, there can thus be no claim of color partiality, as the black sailors would be enlisted in the various required ratings, also as non-rated men if they qualify. It was also noted, BUDOX said, we're willing to create a Negro battalion. We have no problem with this. All of this says there's a path forward for black naval service, at least in these construction battalions. But despite all of this, the General Board will report back to Secretary Knox on February 3rd and said, yeah, we can't submit a plan to bring in black sailors. They have to stay in the messman branch. We've thought of nothing and we're completely out of ideas. And President Roosevelt heard this and went, No, unsatisfactory. Do it over and send it back to the General Board. The General Board then punted the hot potato to the Bureau of Navigation, who then punted it to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold R. Stark. Admiral Stark looked over everything and said, blacks can serve in construction battalions, shore stations for general labor, or on yard craft. And Admiral Ernest J. King, who was Commander of the United States Fleet, later he'd be both CNO and Commander of the United States Fleet. So CINCUS, that he later changed that acronym to COMH. But King concurred, yes, blacks for construction battalions, blacks for general labor. And thus, as you can see, and I apologize for the torn document here, on April 7th, the Navy released this press statement that said black volunteers would be accepted for general service in the reserve components of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard, and we'll use them in naval district craft, shore establishments, Navy yards, and yes, the Seabees. The NAACP, they were pleased with this policy modification. Okay, blacks are going to be able to serve in something other than the messman branch, but they're looking at this going, construction battalions, those sound like unskilled labor battalions. They're not entirely sold on the concept, but they hoped the Navy would move on to, quote, the unrestricted use of all loyal Americans. Now, on April 19th, Admiral Morrell wrote to Admiral Jacobs at Bureau of Navigation about Budoc's plan for the Black Seabees. And what Morrell said is, we're going to establish one or more battalions if we get sufficient volunteers. He also stated that all the leadership for these black construction battalions, all the commissioned officers, the warrant officers, the chief petty officers, as well as the petty officers first class, would be white. And this would leave all the second, third class petty officer ratings open to black personnel. So we're already seeing a segregation here on the leadership. Budocs further realized they actually had no experience with black personnel, so they reached out to the United States Army, particularly the Army Corps of Engineers, for guidance. The Army said, well, we don't have any print material, but we can provide you some recommendations. And what you see here are kind of some of these summarized recommendations. Now, the Army's guidance to Budocs on the training and command of black personnel would be the governing guidance for the men of the 34th Naval Construction Battalion. Misinformed and rather overtly racist, the Army's race perspectives were readily accepted by Budocs and would in time prove to be extremely corrosive to black Seabee morale and the Navy's first attempt at mass racial integration. But confidentiality about all of this ensured this guidance would be hidden from public view. But its influence on the shape of the first Black Naval Construction Battalion would become quite apparent when the first volunteers arrived at Camp Allen in Norfolk. And on 26 September at Naval Construction Training Center at Camp Allen in Norfolk, Virginia, over 1,000 black volunteer recruits reported for active duty. The 34th Naval Construction Battalion would actually have over 70 different construction trades. Almost half of its personnel would come directly from Texas. Among the personnel were 52 college graduates or men with some college education within the enlisted ranks. If these men were white, they likely would have been chief petty officers or potentially officers. During the initial training, over 300 of the black recruits received petty officer ratings for their skills and were recognized for their abilities. But in alignment with Admiral Morrell and the Army guidance, Budocs chose their officers, their chief petty officers first class, predominantly from southern states, to lead the new battalion. But a northerner, however, was chosen to command the battalion. Philadelphia-born John Peter McBean Jr., which you can see here. He was not a southerner by birth, but his racial beliefs were decidedly negative, and he took command in complete concurrence with the Army guidance on the handling of black personnel. On October 23rd, 42, the battalion officially commissioned at Camp Allen. They then completed their preliminary training and moved to nearby Camp Bradford before heading to Advanced Base Depot, Port Hueneme, California, for Pacific service. And at Camp Bradford, McBean began to implement his segregation command philosophy. He segregated the base theater, he segregated the beer gardens, and he segregated the galleys between white and black personnel. And in late November 42, the NAACP first learned of the situation in the battalion. Mailman Specialist Third Class Roscoe Conklin Carroll, seen here on the left in a later photo, who was previously the president of the Atlantic City chapter of the NAACP, wrote to NAACP Secretary Walter White, seen here on the right, on November 26, 42. And Carroll said, something's not right here. I should note, he essentially is going to become an insider for the NAACP regarding the battalion's racial situation, both in 42 all the way through 45. In correspondence with White, Carroll is detailing major issues. He talks about, look, we have segregation. He says there's no black leadership positions. He also mentions that racial epithets are used by the white chief petty officers to the black Seabees. And Carroll also mentions that some of the black sailors were waiting to, quote, take matters into their own hands on foreign soil, which was something that neither he nor White wished to see happen. Carroll then asked for an impartial investigation, and he emphasized the severity of the situation. And when the men of the 34th arrived by rail at Advanced Base Receiving Barracks, Port Hueneme, California, on 2 December, the racial tensions really boiled over for the first time. As recalled by Texan storekeeper second-class Wellington Childs, when he and other black Seabees woke the morning after to use the head, i.e. the latrine, we'll use our Navy parlance here, they found that there were a dozen white sailors telling Childs and the others that the head was for whites only. Childs said, there's no sign on the toilet here. And the black men said, why is it exclusive? And one of the white sailors, construction mechanic first class Mario Pete Curator of Independence, Louisiana, proclaimed that, quote, the officers gave them the authority. Childs then added that Curator went on to say, quote, it would take more than a war to make him mix with us, and that he would rather be with the Japanese than to be with the black sailors. In the ensuing argument, the white chief master of arms ordered all the black Seabees to march to the brig for 36 hours confinement prior to captain's mast or non-judicial punishment hearings. At the hearings, McBean stated succinctly, quote, you boys from the South should know better. And you boys from the North, I'm going to teach you better. There's going to be segregation in the battalion, and you're going to like it. And at captain's mast on 4 December, 5 men received sentences for the offenses of being, quote, unruly, insubordinate, and inciting riot for arguing over segregated toilets. 11 men received 5 days of confinement, some on solitary, on bread and water, including Childs. And a couple errors here pointing out some of these sentences. Gunner's mate third class Adolphus R. Price received 3 days solitary confinement of bread and water for tearing down signs at the latrines. Seaman first class Earl Gardner, I think I have him marked there at the bottom, he received the same sentence for using the white toilet and disobedience. Now, on the eve of departure overseas, the racial divide within this battalion and several other key aspects really warrant re-emphasis. You have to understand there were white officers leading the all-black 34th Naval Construction Battalion, which also included all-white petty officers and all-white first-class petty officers. All the housing, messing, and latrines were segregated, and any black Seabee who refused to accept the situation faced either time in the brig or another form of punishment. Mail was censored, and there was fear of reprisal, and everything was ostensibly structured what could be stated about racial problems. But there are college-educated men, NAACP members, and men who, quite frankly, refused to be silenced within the ranks of the battalion, and they began to speak out. They provided a growing range of evidence regarding what McBean and, by extension, Budox had developed for the unit even before it went overseas. Now, they left the United States in January 1943, and the battalion experienced more segregation at sea. The 850 black personnel were quartered in the transport ship's first 2 forward hatches, while the 280 white personnel enjoyed the spaciousness of the other 2 hatches. The toilets and showers were segregated aboard ship. And along the way, the Seabees crossed the equator. And in keeping in maritime tradition, those aboard paid tribute to King Neptune's courts. But according to Warrant Officer Earl R. Tarwater, there was, quote, considerable dissension among the medical authorities on the dipping tank, whether they could run both the colored and white through the same. But they decided, oh, wait, we can solve this problem. We'll put the white officers and enlisted men to go through the water first, and then the black Seabees, because who knows? I guess colors will bleed, or they'll make mixing colors and whites. I don't know. This is the insanity of racial views at the time. McBean will write back to Morrell after censoring the enlisted male and say, oh, everyone's in great spirits. They're happy to be here. They're anxious to go to work. All is well. On 12 February 43, the battalion will finally arrive at its final destination, and they'll come ashore at Halabo Bay in the Florida Islands. 10 days later, a lone Japanese aircraft will drop 6 bombs around 1:30 in the morning and strike the battalion's ammunition dump. 2 men will be killed in the explosions, 25 men wounded. And yet, here we start to see the doublespeak more of McBean come out, because there's varying sides of what really happened. McBean claims his men were in foxholes, but a white warrant officer testified none had been dug. And he also essentially said McBean had taken no preparations to prepare the men in the event of enemy attack. McBean's personal report of the bombing mentions none of his men were running from fear. He even cites black personnel helping fight fires and rescue the wounded. But in his periodic report to Budox, heading back to Washington, he claimed his men took to the hills out of fear. Now, after completing the Halavo seaplane base in mid-March 43, the battalion will start to kind of break up in groups. One detachment of about 350 men will go to Guadalcanal, and they'll work on airfield facilities and housing around Henderson Field. On 20 April, a second detachment, about 200 men and 75% of the battalion's heavy equipment will go to Russell Island, and there they'll work with other white construction battalions without any racial incidents in preparing 3 airfields for fighter and bomber use in the new Georgia campaign. The entire battalion will then reunite in the Tulagi area about 20 November 43. Half the men will be quartered at Halavo, and others will be scattered around Tulagi, Savo, and Phillips Peninsula on Purvis Bay. And here they're going to work on a whole array of projects. Could be marine railways, fueling docks, coastal defense gun mounts, harbor boat nests, dolphins piers, roads. Seabees can do. And on 25 March 44, the entire battalion will finally come back together in one camp on Guadalcanal to ostensibly finish projects that previous Seabees units had started but never really finished. Now, throughout the combat zone deployment, McBean is going to report back to Budox, as I noted previously, and this really reveals the racial views shaping his actions and the conditions necessitating adjustments. In this tropical environment, it will cause casualties to white and black personnel. McBean will recognize this, and he keeps calling for replacements, but all the time he says, well, his colored boys can stand this climate even better than whites, and they can stand up under the enemy air attacks just as well as whites. This being said after he previously said, oh, they ran from enemy fire. McBean will promote 275 black sailors. He even promotes 8 to petty officer first class, 40 others to petty officer third class, but he kept saying, oh, I can't find any suitable for chief petty officer. To bring this battalion up to full strength, he instead requests white men, quote, selected for their familiarity with Negroes, or officers and chief petty officers with the ability to handle Negroes, characteristics he noted prominent men from below the Mason-Dixon line. All the while, we have to remember that military censorship is in play here with the mail, and the battalion leadership will keep any negative news in check. McBean even chose not to send his battalion to New Zealand or Australia for rest and rehabilitation, stating, quote, these colored troops are not used to cold weather, and that they would rest better in warm weather, presumably back at Advanced Base Depot in heavily Jim Crow Gulfport, Mississippi. Despite all the racial animosity in the leadership, the 34th is recognized as an outstanding construction battalion, and they will receive multiple commendations for their work. Finally, on 13 September 1944, 20 officers and the remaining 759 enlisted men will depart Guadalcanal, and they'll arrive at Camp Park in California for rehabilitation on October 1st. After arriving at Camp Park, the men are going to receive a belated leave to visit their families and get rest. And at this point, Budox's focus is on rebuilding this battalion. Due to this long 21-month overseas deployment in tropical conditions, the men are in poor physical shape, and 150 of them actually fail the physical examination for overseas service, leaving this battalion at half strength. And even before they return home, things are shifting. And there's new leadership in the Navy Department, which is shifting its position on race. And this is going to open up increased service opportunities for African Americans. In May of 1944, James V. Forrestal, senior on the left, will become Secretary of the Navy after the sudden death of Knox. Forrestal is not entirely a racial progressive, but he does have membership in the National Urban League. He's no dummy. He's exposed to the civil rights challenges in the nation. He's cognizant of the problems. And he believes, in terms of efficiency and fairness, black sailors deserve equal opportunities with those of whites. As Secretary of the Navy, he will use his position to act on concluding guidance from what is known as the Special Programs Unit of the Bureau of Personnel's Planning and Control Activity, which had been formed in August 43 under Knox, in his defense, to examine race-related problems. And the Special Programs Unit, after looking at all the data and visiting units firsthand, concludes that, look, segregation is wasteful and inefficient. This is costing the Navy time and money. And the Special Programs Unit will then provide guidance for plans and eventual naval integration to Forrestal. And Forrestal will take that information, incorporate it into his thinking, and he'll then begin to actively experiment with the Navy's personnel policies. And we'll start to see black sailors in small numbers begin to integrate into ships at sea. They'll start to receive commissions, both men and women, and he'll begin to move the Navy slowly towards integration. He realizes, look, I can't swing the door wide open, but let's begin pulling it open. Let's begin getting some opportunities. Now, during leave in October and November, the Seabees are back and they can finally share their experience outside the purview of censorship. On October 23rd, 1944, Assistant NAACP Secretary Roy Wilkins, senior on the right, will catch up with Carroll, who's home on leave, back in New Jersey. After talking to him, Wilkins says, you really should talk to Walter White. And a meeting will take place between Carroll and Walter White on November 10th. And Carroll's comments on the battalion's problems will have an impact on Walter White. And Carroll really focuses on two main issues, the issue of segregation and of the limited promotion opportunities for the Black Seabees. And then in late November 44, the battalion will move from Camp Parks to Port Hueneme, to what was known as Advanced Base Receiving Barracks, Port Hueneme. And there we will see an even greater deterioration in morale. This period also witnesses a remarkable amount of correspondence from these men to the NAACP headquarters. This is just a smattering of kind of the first pages of some of these letters. Now, the letters from the Black Seabees indicate there was really an organized effort at play here to provide uncensored information on what happened over the past 21 months. And here we'll see areas emphasized of friction points. The white Southern officers and chiefs practicing Jim Crow segregation policies overseas. There's inadequate medical care, non-existent promotions for blacks. Whites always get priority. And quite frankly, there's denial of simple rights as citizens, all saying, look, we need the NAACP to investigate the battalion. The NAACP will take all of this correspondence and they will use it to draft a letter to Secretary Forrestal on 11 December. They mention these complaints and they request an investigation. And Forrestal then takes his letter and goes to Admiral Morrell, says, look into this matter. Yes, sir. Morrell takes it. He then forwards it to Port Hueneme and says, tell me what's going on here. And in mid-January 1945, Morrell will hear back and respond to the NAACP with reports from Captain William Seiler, who's the officer in charge of Port Hueneme, as well as Commander McBean. Seiler will state that he spoke to a random selection of men of the battalion. We don't know how we can define random selection. Is it blacks and whites? Is it whites only? Is it blacks only? I don't know. Seiler says, look, I can't verify any claims of brazen and humiliating forms of segregation or any discriminatory conditions. That's balderdash. Meanwhile, McBean and the white chief petty officers, in Seiler's words, reportedly leaned over backward in seeing that the colored men got fair treatment. And Seiler then took even another shot and said, look, I don't think many of the black men in this battalion are even qualified for the rating, and they certainly couldn't pass any Navy examinations. Harumph, harumph. McBean, even more forcefully, will dismiss or deny almost every single accusation from the NAACP. Surprise, surprise. He claims segregation was, quote, an administrative policy, and this was done to ensure harmony. He denies any man ever being confined for protesting discriminatory conditions. Go back to what I shared from December 42. He also reports that 80% of the black personnel had received promotions and they have no right to complaint. Admiral Morrell receives all this and goes, well, they're saying this, so I guess there's no foundation for complaints of discrimination. 5 days after this, though, McBean will write to Morrell in his monthly report, and he describes, quote, considerable unrest between black and white enlisted personnel, and states, quote, the racial problem of handling mixed colored and white braided men stands foremost. And now we come back to the men themselves, who decided to take actions in their own hands. In early January 1945, members of the battalion wrote to Reverend Clayton D. Russell, who's the founder and spiritual leader of the People's Independent Church of Christ. He is one of the leading black figures in Los Angeles. And Russell's ministry, in the words of historian Lauren Foster, really, quote, merged religion and civil rights advocacy to promote the interest of African Americans. He's also on the radio, and it's possible that some of the men of the battalion have heard him on the radio. And as the Seabees would go to Los Angeles and explain directly to Russell, they go, look, we have inadequate medical attention. There's segregation in our facilities. We're being denied promotions. They even say that some men are attempting to transfer out, and they will then find their request literally in the trash can. Other men are going to the extremes of seeking bad conduct discharges just as an escape of last resort. The men need changes, quote, in order to prevent an outbreak of violence between white and Negro personnel. And they even added ominously, quote, we are willing to die here fighting for our rights than to go overseas again with the conditions as they exist now. Reverend Russell, moved by what he heard, decided, I have to act. And in early February 45, evidently of his own accord, Russell will lead a small 4-person group to meet directly with McBean in Port Hueneme with the hope to perhaps produce some change in McBean's racial promotion policies. McBean acknowledged to them that he had recommended 4 black men be promoted to chief petty officer, and he agreed that, yes, morale needed addressing. And he hinted, maybe we'll give some promotions. Maybe that'll help. McBean also praised his men highly. So these are outstanding Seabees, and Russell and the group left saying, okay, we think some change may happen. And that same month, the Los Angeles branch of the NAACP will also launch an investigation into the conditions at Port Hueneme. 2 branch members, both of whom are former Army officers with service in World War I, Norman O. Houston and Moody Stanton, will visit Port Hueneme on 27 February, and they will in turn report their findings back to Roy Wilkins in New York, who's the acting NAACP secretary, because Walter White was actually overseas visiting black personnel in the war effort. In this report, McBean is described as a, quote, hard-boiled naval officer and a Simon Legree type. The investigators also find that black Seabees were promised promotions that never materialized, while white sailors with inferior skills were promoted and then transferred out of the battalion. The whites also got better quarters, and they had separate mess lines. Black personnel suffered moral damage from heavy penalties for petty violations and excessive brig time. Houston and Statner conclude that this battalion is, quote, on the brink of mutiny, and they recommended an immediate Navy Department investigation, pointing out that McBean and the rather hated executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Clyde Vickers White, seen here on the right, be detached from the battalion pending an investigation. But Houston and Statton's report, quite frankly, arrives too late for a response. On Friday 2 March, approximately 1,000 men of the battalion coordinate a hunger strike. They sit in silence while the white personnel eat. The men do report to their work details. They will perform all their duties. They will report to the mess hall. They just will not eat. And the strike continues the next day, but it will end on Sunday. The entire battalion then returns to the mess halls and their navy blue fatigue uniforms, as reported, as a symbol of protest. Now, the reason for the strike's conclusion after 2 days, quite frankly, is unknown. I have not found a distinctive answer why. The white voices claim the Seabees gave in to hunger. The black voices say, no, the strike achieved its purpose. And the purpose, I would point out or argue, is because of the news media. News of this hunger strike, as I began the talk, has spread nationwide in the white and black press. And the Los Angeles NAACP branch aids this process because they have their own investigation and all this internal knowledge. Reverend Russell also will at this point write letters to various government officials, including President Roosevelt, Secretary Forrestal, as well as several of the congressional delegation of California. And he particularly points out McBean's attitude and this denial of promotions for black Seabees as the cause of the battalion's unrest. By the end of the strike, McBean and his officers had really identified who the leaders, in their opinion, leaders and instigators of the strike were. They pointed to the Los Angeles branch of the NAACP. They point to Russell. The Navy will also name shipfitter first class Albert Raymond Harris, seen here on the left, as well as motor machinist mate first class Charles Lewis Pembroke as the primary strike organizers. And they had 5 other men assisting them. The Navy investigators, quite frankly, say Russell aided and abetted this nonviolent plan and may have given them the exact guidance. But again, this is conjecture. I personally have not found a conclusive piece of evidence. McBean at this point says, take all these identified men, send them to the brig, hold them without cause or charges, pending further investigation for a general court-martial. The idea here is let's essentially remove the enlisted leaders from view so that the battalion commander can reexert control. And while all this is happening, political leaders are receiving letters and telegrams about the hunger strike. And the NAACP in New York is more than happy to provide copies of all the correspondence, as well as release portions of the Houston State Report to the press. And this in turn prompts congressional requests for an investigation. The Navy springs into action, and the Navy's Inspector General's office will launch its own investigation into the hunger strike, which takes place from 13 to 16 March. They interview officers, they interview enlisted men, they interview Houston, they interview Reverend Russell. During this time, 4 of the strike leaders are released from the brig without charges, and no explanation given. The NAACP is also going to develop a fascinating back channel between Secretary Forrestal and Carroll. Carroll will actually meet with 4 officers of Forrestal's office for several hours, and they discuss promotions, discrimination, segregation, and punishment. And Carroll acts as a essentially honest, good egg, honest person, witness of what's transpired over the 21 months overseas. On 28 March, the Naval Inspector General releases its report, part of it you can see here, which confirmed that, yes, there was segregation, there was very low morale. They consider McBean as, quote, not qualified through temperament and prejudice to command Negro enlisted men in large groups. It only took them 2 years, but, better late than never. Recommendations also will then include transferring McBean and the strike leaders out of the battalion, replacing 20% of the white officers and chief petty officers with non-Southern personnel, and implementing colorblind policies for the quartering, messing, as well as duty assignments. Lieutenant Commander Lester Matthew Marks of Rochester, New York, will then replace McBean as the officer in charge of the battalion. He's a civil engineering graduate of Ohio Northern University, and he has extensive pre-war construction experience in both Central America and the United States. And when Marks comes in, he also brings in new officers from 2 other battalions he had previously served in, after he had ensured that they, after personally interviewing them all, that they had no openly admitted racial prejudices. For the Black Seabees of the 34th, the replacement of McBean by Marks and the end of segregation and discrimination policies proved a much-needed tonic. One letter to the NAACP described this as, quote, these servicemen are calling the replacement of McBean as the new emancipation. On 19 April, the reborn battalion will board a troop transport at Port Hueneme bound for Okinawa. And once at sea, the new era under Marks demonstrated itself immediately. The men experienced no discrimination aboard the troop transport or on Okinawa. In June, Marks will promote 3 men of this battalion who had served since its establishment to chief petty officer, breaking through discrimination's glass ceiling. In a letter to Carroll, a friend in the battalion praised Marks' actions, writing that the changes represented, quote, the greatest victory for the NAACP in my mind, and in spite of the mean and irreparable damage done to the minds and character of those of us left here. But the end has justified the means and the sacrifice. Until the Japanese surrender on 2 September, the men of the battalion will work on an array of projects on Okinawa, which you can see some of it here. These projects include construction and or maintenance of roads, building magazines for dynamite storage. They built an ammunition depot. They helped build the Awazi airstrip. They developed a Seabee provisional trucking company. They built mine assembly depot number 8. And they did numerous other tasks that ultimately totaled 500,000 man-hours. By September 10th, the Naval Construction Troops, under the Service Force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, recommended returning this battalion to the United States for inactivation. And this task was completed on November 24th. The 7 strike leaders would all receive honorable discharges in October 1945. 3 of them would actually return to the military and serve in the Korean War in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. All the while, with the 34th back overseas and operational, the Navy, in an interesting twist, found themselves in an enviable position relative to the Army. On June 4, 45, Rear Admiral William L. Friedel, Commandant of the 11th Naval District, recommended to Secretary Forrestal that no further disciplinary action be taken against the strike organizers, hence the honorable discharges. He further concluded that, quote, any additional action taken at this time would only serve to aggravate the allegations. In July of 45, newspapers nationwide are sharing a report by Lester Granger, Executive Secretary of the National Urban League, as well as Special Civilian Aide on Racial Affairs to Secretary Forrestal, about his inspection tour of 12 naval stations, bases, and depots in 4 naval districts. And Granger says, look, the Navy's policy to integrate blacks in all phases of service is far ahead of anything the Army is doing, while also being, quote, honestly and intelligently administered and admirably sound. After beginning the war using the Army guidance, the Navy, as historian Trent Home would say, as a complex adaptive system, learned and adapted. Willingly, it changed its policies and actions to improve effectiveness for warfighting. The actions by Forrestal, which were heavily supported by Admiral King, had brought the Navy greater integration and opportunities for Black Americans, at least compared to the Army, and certainly far greater than the pre-war military overall. So ultimately then, the 34th fought twin wars at home and abroad, and it emerged victorious in both, albeit at considerable cost. The men in the battalion, who volunteered to serve both their nation and their race in the uniform of the Navy, endured forms of discrimination that did not rise to the extremism of their treatment under McBean's command. But that treatment, over years, compounded by the blissful ignorance of Budox's leadership and the rather vicious enthusiasm on the part of some select white officers and chief petty officers, motivated unprecedented activism by the Black Seabees of the 34th Battalion with the cultivation of support from the NAACP. The racial friction, which became cataclysmic in fall of 1942, faded from view after the battalion went overseas in January of 43. But over the ensuing 21 months, the Black members of the battalion faced the daily challenges of the tropical conditions, Japanese air raids, and ongoing racial segregation. Censorship of enlisted correspondence, aggressive use of the brig and the Articles of War, and optimistic monthly reports about the battalion's performance really concealed a metaphorical cancer metastasizing throughout the battalion, destroying its members' morale and limiting its effectiveness as a fighting construction force. Once returned to the United States and beyond the reach of naval censorship, the members of the battalion could finally air racially charged grievances. Family and friends heard such news with sadness and empathy. And moreover, multiple members, as we heard, turned to their membership in the NAACP or otherwise took initiatives to contact Black civil rights leaders and sympathetic politicians to detail the patterns of behavior exhibited by McBean and condoned by Budox. After countless letters and conversations yielded no discernible results over several months, the battalion staged a nonviolent protest in such mass as to avoid arrests and deny naval leaders a charge of mutiny. Due to the NAACP's political savvy and the free voices of former battalion members who corroborated information, amplified by national news media, senior naval leaders were at last pressured into seeing and admitting that the Black Seabees' previously stated grievances, which Budox had denied, were in fact true. These brave, long-term efforts to bring visibility and recognition to the courageous work of the Black Seabees caused changes in the battalion that made a second overseas deployment more harmonious. Only weeks prior to that hunger strike in March of 45, the Navy released its landmark publication, Guide to Command of Negro Naval Personnel. Within the guide's introduction is found this statement that, quote, the success or failure of each commanding officer in the administration of Negroes under him will be determined largely by the spirit in which he approaches the problem and the degree of attention given to it. For the men of the 34th Naval Construction Battalion, the guide arrived too late. For those who partook in the battalion's second deployment, however, the leadership under Marks embraced the guide's spirit, if not its specific text, for the betterment of the nation's Navy writ large. For the NAACP, the lengthy battle on behalf of the battalion did not right every wrong, but it played into the wider strategy to integrate the Navy. Working with Congress and the news media, the NAACP established a model for advocating integration of the nation's armed forces, which would translate into greater actions in the ensuing decades. For the Bureau of Yards and Docks, the pioneering African American Seabee volunteers of the 34th, as well as other battalions, helped forge the enduring Seabee culture of can-do, not only in the ability to achieve the difficult at once and the impossible in a day, but in which a person is judged on their skills and their ingenuity rather than on the color of their skin. I thank you all for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
If you don't know Frank's work or know him well, he's a historian that really goes to the primary documents to find these stories and to tell these stories and place them in context. And he's not a historian that just regurgitates stuff that everybody else has already done. So Frank, I really appreciate you taking the time to share this research with us. It does look like we have several questions. So if you're ready, we'll get started.
Fire away.
Do we know if any of these sailors went on to have jobs or start their own businesses in construction after the war?
So I know that some of these men had businesses prior to the war. In some cases, we had men with over 20 years general contracting experience. Mm-hmm. And they were told they're not qualified to be a chief petty officer because they were Black. Post-war, what's fascinating here is I have not found any oral histories. I've found almost no real mention of men associating with the 34th Battalion my understanding is many of them went right back to what they did before the war, presumably or ostensibly taking some of the skills they acquired in the Navy and employing them into their civilian occupations. But I haven't found anything, kind of directly linked. The most interesting person in a way is Roscoe Conklin Carroll, because he ends up getting his law degree, and he will end up working for one of the largest Black-owned insurance companies in California. And at one point in the 1960s, President Johnson actually nominated him to be on the board of directors of PBS. It's not entirely, I admit I have not done all the biographical research on all people, but of all the men in the battalion, he by far sticks out in terms of what he went on to achieve post-war in his career. And for another potential talk, the 80th Naval Construction Battalion, which is the other predominantly Black Seabee battalion, likewise has a few people that went on to really do some amazing work in terms of the civil rights movement, really in their community and grassroots level. And also we have many tragedies of men who served, tried to go back into the businesses of construction after the war. And it's very sad to find some of them committed suicide. And I don't know if it was from post-traumatic stress. I quite frankly don't know, or just the culmination of the war's effects caused them to take their own life. But these stories are lost, and I'm still in the effort to kind of resurrecting them. And I hope with this video here, with this presentation, for listeners, if you know of anyone connected with the battalions, any of the Black Seabees and any of their organizations in World War II, please don't be a stranger. Please reach out, leave your comments, send your comments to the memorial, leave them on YouTube. I'd love to hear from you. And I'd love to kind of pull that story into this broader research project.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned the 80th. I think they trained here in Norfolk as well.
Yes, yeah. They came right at. When the 34th kind of moved out, the 80th stood up, is really how that worked out. So.
All right, next question. Are there any efforts to better recognize this unit since most people don't know the story, such as a book? Is there a book in the works?
Yes, the book. So at risk of showing my cards here, this talk is a variant of it will be published in the Journal of Military History this coming April. The original paper was around 60 pages long. The paper on the 80th is about 70 pages long. So yes, I intend to do a book. I have a lot going on with both work and family and extracurriculars, so I haven't had a chance to really start to put it together. The biggest challenge right now is I want to find, it's one thing to have the documents, it's one thing to have the archival records. I really want to try and find the families and get more of the stories directly from the families. And that's kind of been my limiting factor at the moment to pursuing a book, because I want to not just make it kind of I don't want to say a dry history, but a history purely based on archival records. But I want some of those living voices from the present pulled back into this story to try and frame it properly in the Black Seabee story of World War II, and really how it affected the Navy of today, and how the Black Seabees, I would argue, are a key part of the Navy's ability to integrate and to begin to integrate during the war after decades of extreme racial exclusivity. So I will get there. And if anyone's listening and says, hey, Frank, I can help, please reach out. I'd love to hear from you.
All right. Next question. Do they have the Congressional Gold Medal? Or do you think that will be in the works at some point?
It would be wonderful. One could argue maybe all the Seabees of World War II should wear the Congressional Gold Medal, black and white, because as a whole, Seabees can do. And it's the Navy really had an unbelievable force that built across the world, right, everywhere, and continue to be an amazing group of men and women to this day. I would love to see the Seabees receive or be nominated for Congressional Gold Medal. Not to mention there's many other groups, the POWs of the Pacific War, another group that's really forgotten today to some extent. It would be great to finally see them be recognized for their heroism, standing up against the worst of the worst throughout the war and returning with honor. So hopefully, if anyone wants help drafting legislation, let me know. Be happy to help.
Okay, next question. Does the U.S. Navy Seabee Museum recognize the 34th in any displays?
They do. So there's a hallway. Now, it's been a while since I worked there, I left in January 2015. But there was a hallway where they have all the battalion plaques, and I had a picture of that in the slideshow. And yes, the 34th plaque is there. There's also imagery of the 34th that's used in some of the displays there. So they are recognized. Of the battalions of the 34th and 80th, the 34th is a weird way to phrase this, the more photogenic, and that there's a lot more surviving imagery of the 34th, predominantly from its first deployment. And that's the bulk of the African American Seabee images one will see on social media or see online are from the 34th. So they are getting recognition. And even in the Navy's official history of the Seabees in World War II, called building the Navy's bases, you see images of the 34th work or the 80th featured prominently in the two volumes.
Okay, next question. Was the battalion sent to the Pacific Front in the Philippines or surrounding islands to assist in the building and maintaining of roads and infrastructure during the war, or did they encounter combat?
So the 34th never went to the Philippines. As I mentioned in the talk, they were in Guadalcanal and the area in the Solomon Islands. They did experience a Japanese air attack, and they did experience kind of the aftermath of the battlefield. So it could be unexploded ordnance or potentially a Japanese soldier that had remained in hiding. But the 80th Battalion absolutely was in the Philippines. And after American forces had moved back in 1945, the 80th operated in and around on Luzon and in and around Manila Bay. They did a lot of operations there in kind of July and August, September of 1945. So they absolutely were operating there. And kind of a side note, perhaps, Amanda, a future talk, there's the other black Seabee units were known as Special Naval Construction Battalions. And the Seabee Specials were stevedore units. We take for granted the luxury of compartmentalized shipping today. We're back during the war, it was slinging your cargo nets and everything is moving individual boxes. So there were battalions of white and black stevedores set up specifically to unload cargo ships in combat areas, particularly in the Pacific theater. And in the Philippines, you will see at the end of the war, as units are being rotated home or personnel have enough points on the point system to be discharged, they take the black and the white stevedore units and go and smush them together. And we have the demographic data on some of these units, and they're almost exactly 50-50 black and white personnel. And it's a story that's really never been told, that the Navy had completely integrated operational units in the front in 45.
Really?
No historiography about this. And they absolutely were in the Philippines and crucial to what General MacArthur and the Navy were doing in the fight, because the fighting was still going on when the war ends in September 45. And so it's another fascinating little story that hasn't fully been told. And going back to an earlier question, if a book comes along, yes, this will be in the book. Absolutely.
Right. We're going to have to talk more about this. That's so interesting. I didn't know that had happened.
It was something that I stumbled on when I worked at the Seabee Museum, and I was flabbergasted because I said, I've read a lot of books about race issues in World War II, being Army, Navy, Marine Corps, whatnot. I had never heard about this. And yet the data's there. And even some of these units had 4, 5, or 6 black chief petty officers. So they probably had more black chief petty officers than any other unit in the entire Navy, in the entirety of the history of the United States Navy at that point.
In the Philippines.
In the Philippines.
The end of the war.
In the Philippines, yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's really interesting. We're gonna have to talk more, and you're gonna have to tell us what you find as you go down and do that research. Next question. How did the 34th compare with other Seabee units in terms of rewards or citations?
So the Seabee units they're not really guts and glory, right? Their focus is building, not fighting. So you don't see many overall, of all the Seabees of the Second World War, we have over 300,000. Not many of them receive, say, a presidential unit citation or any type of major unit citation. They typically get letters of commendation that the head of a naval district or a particular force commander would say, well done. And the 34th more than received its share of work for what it did in its first deployment. It was recognized for outstanding work. They worked with white construction battalions without incident on a cumulative mission. There were men of the 34th recognized with, the Navy Marine Corps Medal, or they received a letter of commendation. In one case, an aircraft coming into Henderson Field hit a truck that some of the Seabees were in, and the Seabees pulled the other wounded out of the truck. They got the pilot out of the aircraft, and they received letters of commendation for their work. So with the one photograph, as you saw, some of the men did receive Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in the air attack in February 1945. So the 34th, they weren't denied recognition that I can tell, comparatively speaking, to the other Seabee battalions. So on that level, everything, again, things look fine on the surface, so to speak. And it's when you begin to dig down that you go, wait a minute, something's amiss. But at least for the brass hats, let's use that expression, up high, they said, these guys are great. They're getting the missions done. They're getting the construction done on time. They're doing solid quality work. Well done. And the work spoke for itself. It really did. Particularly when 21 consecutive months, no R&R, no leaves. These men are not being rotated home, or we think of other conflicts. Okay, you get a week vacation here. They stayed at the front the entire time in the jungles, living in the jungle conditions. And Seabees are also typically not young men. Many Seabees are going to be in their 30s. They're going to be in their 40s. They're not, say, the 18, 19-year-olds. Some are, but a lot are older. And they're also going through rather extreme conditions and living through that austerity. So, and they were loyal to their country, and they believed in the cause. And to be able to take a story like this that's been forgotten and bring it back is kind of a reward, at least for myself, unto itself.
Well, as you know, we obviously cover a lot of the Pacific War because of General MacArthur. And whenever people ask, how did we win this war in these vast regions, these massive theaters? And I think, well, there's a lot that goes into that. But I always go back to like the Merchant Marine, the Seabee, like these support and like kind of logistics services that really just made a lot of that possible from the start, so
the hammer, the rivet gun, the acetylene torch, these are the tools of victory.
Right. You said it. That was very poetic. I like that. All right. Next question. Oh, we've got a gentleman on here that says his father was the original dental officer with the 34th. He talked about his experiences for years. And as a non-combatant, he looked at things from a different perspective, more as a healthcare professional. And he would be willing to share these stories to add perspective. So wonderful.
I will be reaching out, sir. I don't recall
Wonderful.
anyone complaining about dental care in any of the correspondence I ever read. So no one ever spoke ill of your father that I know of. And that was, again, one of the interesting things about the Seabee units. They took in men from the dental corps and from the medical corps, and they were pulled in alongside these civil engineer corps officers. So they do have a different perspective because they're coming essentially from a different branch of the Navy. And many of them did stay with the battalions throughout their history. And they serve as this beautiful continuity between deployments of what's really transpiring, what's really happening. And they're able to look at things from that, to a degree, outsider's perspective and provide some unbiased commentary. So I absolutely look forward to talking to you, sir.
We have another comment. Someone's dad was in one of those integrated stevedore units in the Philippines. Wow, that's really, really cool.
Do you have the unit do you have the information on the unit? If not, please contact MacArthur Memorial. I'm at the Smithsonian. I'm at risk of sounding awkward. I'm not hard to find. But I would love to hear from you because
Yes.
I also help a lot of folks reconnect. They say, well, my relative was a Seabee, but I don't know what unit. If you don't know the exact stevedore unit, please reach out. And I'm happy to share any and all of the research I have. Love to talk to you.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, again, Frank, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us. This concludes our program. We will have more of these to come. So if you would like to visit our website, MacArthurMemorial.org, you can see a full schedule, or at least what we've scheduled out to this point. And we are also taking topic suggestions. So if you would like us to cover something in one of these virtual events, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again. We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.